Means okay, let's get started for the special meeting for Conservation Commission November 5th. Please silence your cell phones, be appreciated. And if you're recording, please let us know. We're going to start here with public meeting, public comment for items not being heard. Is there anything? Excellent. Okay, so we're going to the public hearing. Notices of intent for Sconset Beach Preservation Fund, 59-119 Baxter Road.
All right, so
Just to kind of set everyone up, this is a continuation from the hearing that was scheduled for 2 weeks ago that was missed, and the topics that were set for that meeting were for sand transport and sand mitigation. So those kind of move forward, and then the next set of topics that we had already kind of set up for the next hearing on was for wildlife habitat and then other issues. So things like pre-78 qualifications and all those fun things. So it's kind of the catch up, and then we'll set kind of a set of topics for the next round after that as well. So just to kind of get everyone caught up.
great. Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates, and also joining me today is Gordon Thompson and Les Smith to talk about the topics of sediment transport and the sand template protocol. And Attorney Stephen Cohen is also here to represent the applicants. As we know that, for the, there we go. As Jeff mentioned, I'm just going to do an overall overview of the project, kind of where we've been with the previous hearings, response to comments, and where we are tonight. Then Gordon will talk about sediment transport, and Les will talk about the template management. The existing project, about 900 feet from 87 to 105. Get the next. And the topic for the project for this current notice of intent is to extend the project to the north, 105 to 119, and then to the south between lots 59 to 87 Baxter Road. The this proposed expansion of the GO2 project has been designed to comply with the performance standards for the Wetlands Protection Act and the bylaw as discussed at the last hearing. The limits of the project have been selected purposely, extending to the north from 105 to 119 Baxter Road, about 900 feet, with homes that are pre-78 homes or vacant lots. The bluff is eroding, and the bluff and bank is eroding, and it's there to protect the existing homes, the public infrastructure. To the south, we kind of have two zones. The furthest extent of the project, down 59 to about 67 or so Baxter Road. We still have some vegetated bluff. The bluff is eroding, but there's still some vegetation on the higher elevations. The public walk continues to extend up to about lot 67. The purpose here is to protect the toe and maintain the stability of the existing bluff as best possible. And then from about 67 up to 87, we have the eroding bluff. The walkway has been closed. It's pretty much all pre-78 homes, and so the purpose here is to stabilize the bluff and avoid or try to prevent existing erosion of the coastal bank to protect those homes and the public infrastructure. As mentioned, it was the purpose here was designed to protect the interest of the Act of Storm Damage Prevention and Flood Control that's provided by Coastal Bank and Beach. And the overall program is there to provide the adequate volume of sand into the littoral system as part of the project. In terms of the sand mitigation summary that's proposed in the notice of intent and provided in some greater detail in the response to comments submitted to the commission on Friday. Once the project, the expanded project would be constructed, and the existing project that's still in place is to fill the template with 22 cubic yards per linear feet of compatible sand. That's at the beginning of the storm season, before the storm season. Periodically contribute sand off the template to exposed geotubes after erosion events. At the end of the storm season, determine what was contributed from the template based on the monitoring that's done, and then prior to the next storm season, refill the template with the volume of sand that was lost, or up to 22 cubic yards per linear foot. In some ways, kind of the analogy to think of this as your car with a gas tank. So you start out and you fill your tank, you drive around for a while, you determine what you need to do to, how many gallons you've used, and then you top it off again. So that's the idea with the proposed mitigation. Think about that summary. The proposed mitigation was designed to be consistent with the regulations and the CZM policy of stabilization policy number 1. It, in terms of the regulations, it protects the stability of the coastal bank. That's the purpose of the project. Number 2 is the regulations require that projects use the best available measures to supply sediment to other downdrift resource areas. So the sand template, managing the sand template and placing sand during the storm season is the best available measure for this project. And when we look at the coastal profile data that the Woods Hole Group collects as part of the existing project for that order of conditions, and it predates the orders of conditions, as well as the nearshore cobble and boulder habitat surveys that are conducted, we see that there's apparently no adverse effect to these resource areas of coastal bank, beach, and land under ocean from the existing project. And with the proposed mitigation protocol, each year, the sand that's lost off the template will be replaced onto the template for reuse to periodically place sand into the littoral system during the winter storm season. As way of comparison of the existing order of conditions with the conditions that outline template management and then the proposed protocol, we see that in condition 32, it's identified to place 22 cubic yards per linear foot per year based on a schedule. The proposed protocol is to fill the template with 22 cubic yards per linear foot and then backfill up to that volume at the end of each, before the storm season. Maintain 2 feet of cover over the geotubes to protect them from UV degradation. That is, proposed to remain. The Malone and McBroom letter that's referenced in the existing order of conditions, 32C, talks about placing 10 to 15 cubic yards of per linear foot at the beginning of the storm season and place additional sand on an as-needed basis. The proposed project, for the proposed protocol, 22 cubic yards per linear foot. And then to propose that the exposed geotubes after an erosion event would be recovered within 10 business days. Right now, it's, according to the order of conditions, it's as soon as possible. So trying to give some more definition of time. Delivery tickets, that would continue. And then part of the failure criteria is to, if repair or replacement can't be done, it needs to be done within 30 days. If it can't, the applicant needs to notify the commission why and develop a schedule about how that would be fixed. Under the protocol, in terms of repairs of replacement, that 30 days is carried forward. But in terms of sand management, the idea is to recover the exposed geotubes within 10 business days. If that's not possible, multiple storms, whatever, then to notify the Conservation Commission, Natural Resources Department, and describe why and develop a schedule for that. So with the proposed protocol, we looked at that relative to the existing order for the current project, which is in many ways a demonstration for the larger project, to try to refine that to a protocol that's protective of the environment and then still manageable by the applicant. With that, protocol, the issue that we'll also talk about is the Littoral Drift system. You know better than anybody else that Nantucket has a very dynamic littoral drift system. We see, the project area in southeast corner of the island, CZM has identified this project area as essentially a nodal point where you get generally sand transport heading north, which we can see off the spit, and you also get sand transport to the south. And actually, you get down by the sewer beds, you can kind of see some movement of sand that ties in with the offshore sand. And then, also with the CZM comment letters, they comment about the nodal point, but also with the shoreline change maps, we see that to the north of this project area, it has on their 164-year data set from 1864 or so to 2009, to the north of the project area is somewhat higher erosion rates. On an average basis, they have about 0.75 feet per year. And to the south, it's down to about 0.1 feet per year of erosion. But again, that's over 160 plus years. So there's erosion periods, accretion periods, and we know from the project, this project and the previous projects, that the more recent shoreline change has been a lot more dynamic than that long-term 160-year period. Thus, for this project, we've been using project-specific erosion rates, loss rates, contribution rates, whatever you want to call it, for the evaluation of the bank and the design of the mitigation. And this is just a close-up where you can start to see sand coming off the point and entering into the bars, as well as further offshore. And likewise, whether this is tying into the shoals or to the bars, but you can see that there's connection here between the shoreline and the offshore sediment sources. As I mentioned briefly in my introduction, we provided a response to comments for the comments that we had received to date through October 30th. Generally, those comments have focused on from the Nantucket Land Council and Applied Coastal to sediment transport and sand mitigation protocol program. So that's the topic of tonight's meeting. So we're going to address that in detail as we move forward. The Coastal Conservancies comments were primarily about the existing project and whether or not that project is complying with the order of conditions. We covered that in pretty good detail last hearing, and we've also provided it to the Commission in the 40 or so page comment letter that was submitted on Friday. There's also comments in the record from Commissioner Golding about the pre-78 homes. We've addressed that in writing with the submission of materials on Friday, and basically it's resubmitting the building department data for these homes along Baxter Road that was previously submitted in 2013, prepared by Attorney Cohen. One response that we did not get into writing on Friday because we were looking for input from our team member of Woods Hole Group, is one of the applied coastal research and engineering comments about an annualized shoreline change. The data that's provided in the quarterly reports by Woods Hole, the most recent was the 77th survey report that was submitted within the last month. And in those reports, they're generally looking at deltas between snapshots in time, such as 2001 to 2013, 2013 to 2018, September of 18 to August of 17. What Applied Coastal did was to take that data and annualize that by taking those observed changes between those snapshots in time, dividing it by the time to present a rate of time or a rate of shoreline change. And this graph that they provided with their comments basically is showing the post-geotube project in red and the pre-geotube project in blue, and they're indicating that the geotube, that the rates of shoreline change are higher on an annual basis than post-geotube project versus pre. The yellow is the existing geotube project area, then it extends from the sewer beds up to the north. Looking at annualized rate of change is one way to look at it as opposed to just those snapshots in time. Woods Hole has the same data set, and what they did is they did the same thing, but they put it in context with the longer term data that there is available. So what you can see is red is the 5-year period, essentially the post-geotube project. And so we have the period post-geotube time. So we have the red line. Negative means loss of shoreline or erosion. This is accretion. The 01 to 2013. So you can see there's somewhat lower rate of erosion north of the project. South, you still see these lines intersecting, and there's quite a bit of variability as you go further south. But they also added 2 other time periods. One is the 94 to 01, which is the black with circles, which is in here. And then this past year, where this is August of 17 to September of 18. So this includes this past winter with all the storms that we've had. And we actually see in the project area, as well as to the south, we see some accretion, and then to the north we see, again, variability depending on where we are. So when we look at these 2 time periods in relationship to the full time period for which we have data, we see there's a lot of scatter around along the shoreline, and therefore to make a conclusion that in just looking at 2 time periods, we need to look at that relative to the other time periods. The other thing to look at is we're talking about a shoreline that's about 5 miles long, and here we have a 500-foot reach within that shoreline. And there's a lot of variables that will be talked about in terms of sediment transport, about what's happening to the south and to the north, and in terms of that 900 feet being the only variable that changes things far afield is hard to really have cause and effect from that. One of the other things that we've looked at, because shoreline change is one thing to look at in terms of change in the shoreline, the other thing is volume. Woods Hole also looks at their cross sections and compares the volume at those cross sections. This is right out of their report. It's very hard to read, so I'm not going to ask anyone to do that. But what we see, what I've done here with this line and this line, this is the shaded is the existing project area. This is the extent of the proposed expansion area to the north, and this is the extent of the proposed project area to the south. And as we provide in the written comments, we generally see a lower rate of erosion post geotube than the previous time periods. And when we look at the last year, this past year, we actually see when we sum up all of these changes, we actually see a net increase in the volume of the sum of these cross-sectional areas within the project area in this past year, and that even includes this past winter. So in terms of sand mitigation program, there seems to be adequate sand being contributed to the littoral system from the existing project. And from that graph, from that data, we did what Applied Coastal did in annualizing the periods. So what we did was take those snapshots in time, divided them by the time period. So what we see south of the existing geotube system, we had erosion rates of this volume. In the last 5 years, we have much lower erosion rates. And in the 12 years prior, we have lower to about the same. North of the project area, again, which from the CZM shoreline change data, shoreline change project is showing greater erosion rates north of the project area. For the past 5 years, post-geotube project, we see it's lower than the 7-year period from the mid-90s to early 2000s. And depending on where we are, we see somewhat increased or about the same. So with that, I'll pass it on to Gordon to talk in more detail about sediment transport mechanisms, and then follow him will be Les talking about the mitigation program. So we have kind of the science describing what's happening out here, and then the proposed program.
Thank you, Dwight. Excuse me, is that microphone operational? I can only hear the person's voice. I don't hear the amplification.
Tap it.
Yes.
Make sure you have it pointed right at your mouth.
Get a little closer.
There you go.
My name's Gordon Thompson. I'm with WF Baird & Associates, and I'm going to be chit-chatting today about sediment transport. So talking about sediment transport mechanisms. First, I'm going to talk about cross-shore transport, and what does that mean? Cross-shore transport is the movement of sediment from the top of the bluff to the base of the bluff, as well as from the base of the bluff to offshore. And you'll notice in this graphic that I just have a downward arrow going from the top of the bluff to the base, but there's a two-headed arrow from the base of the bluff to the offshore. And I'm going to get into that, but really what I'm trying to show with this graphic is that once you lose material from the bluff, and that bluff erodes, there's no obviously getting that bluff back. However, from the material at the base of the bluff out into deeper water depths, you actually see an exchange of sediment across that entire width. The other element that I'm going to be talking about is longshore transport. And longshore transport is the movement of sediment along the shoreline. So in this case, we're looking at north to south transport as compared to an east to west type of transport. The other element is a process called diffusion. And diffusion is important because it increases the longshore transport rate, though it is a fundamentally different process. And again, I'm going to discuss this in several more slides. So for cross-shore transport, really you're looking at a movement of sand onshore and offshore. It's in constant movement in the cross-shore direction. Now technically, if you just have sand that's moving onshore and offshore, you don't have erosion. Your shoreline can move, but you technically don't have erosion. And I'll get into why you will end up with erosion because that's in a longshore process. But when you move sediment strictly in a cross-shore direction, you don't have erosion. As I was discussing earlier, the landward extent of this is the top of the unprotected bluff. So while you can lose your bluff and the bluff will recede, that sediment will work its way down into the system and remain in a cross-shore sense within that section. The seaward extent of that cross-shore movement can be anywhere between minus 25 and minus 35 feet. You may end up with some movement beyond that, but then that will be a loss from the system. But in coastal engineering terms, we call that the depth of closure. So with cross-shore transport, what you might see when you go out to a beach is you'll hear about a summer and winter profile, where in winter the beach might be deflated, it might be a little lower, might be a little narrower. And then in summer months, the beach becomes wider and a little bit higher. And that is a function of that sediment moving from the offshore to the onshore and back. One thing that happens, interestingly, in Nantucket and along this stretch of shoreline, you actually don't see this marked movement of sediment between winter and summer profiles. It is there to an extent. But in other sections of the country, it's much more distinct. And I'm going to show you some profiles, though, at Sconset so you can understand about this movement. However, this concept is the same, that you get a redistribution of sand across the profile based on storms. So during storms, sand gets moved offshore, and then during calmer periods of time, that sand will get moved back onshore. So I'm going to look at profile 95. It's about 2,000 feet north of the proposed geotube system. So this is profile 95. The vertical axis is elevation. It's in feet mean low water. Each of the horizontal bars is at 5-foot increments. And on the on the x-axis is cross-shore distance from essentially our monument location. So the profile right now is May 2017, as you'll see there. So we compare that to the October 2017 profile. What you'll see is in around the -5 elevation. You see a pickup of sand. You actually see the profile up to +10 being slightly seaward of the May 2017 profile. What you're seeing a little further down between -10 and -15 are some bar features that essentially have moved. And so that's you're seeing, again, some cross-shore redistribution of sediment. In May 2018, again, you're seeing a seaward movement of the shoreline, shown by the orange, and some, again, movement in the offshore area. Looking at another profile, profile 88, which is to 1,500 feet to the south. Again, here's the May 2017 profile. Again, you'll see some variations in the offshore section and some accretion in the +5 to +10 foot range. And this is natural variation in the beach. Again, May 2018, you're seeing some what we call deflation in the offshore section. And again, some advance of the dry section of the beach. And again, this again could change, and you'll, as you're aware, will see that upward section of the beach sometimes erode. But really, what I'm trying to relay here is that you're seeing movement of sediment across the profile, from deeper offshore to the template, the dry portion of the beach, and then from the dry portion of the beach to the offshore. However, the one item that we know is that when the bluff face collapses, this is a cross-shore transport process, the bluff is not rebuilding. So when you get to above +15, +20, you're not seeing that sediment rebuild. And that's really what this project is about, is trying to protect that bluff face from collapsing, but then providing the sediment that would have been contributed to the system from that bluff face, being proactively putting that into the system so that then that sediment can move back and forth in a cross-shore direction. What we see is that when the bluff face collapses, generally you have undercutting of the bluff face by waves during a storm event. The bluff may collapse during that event, and when I say collapse, I'm talking about maybe a foot or two, maybe more of the top of that bluff receding. So that may occur during the storm event. It may occur a day or two after the storm event. It may occur a month after the storm event. It may occur much longer. A lot just depends on the bluff will have a natural slope, and it will just depend sometimes on rainfall and the type of material as to when that bluff may collapse. So why is this relevant? So what I want to get across here is that cross-shore transport does not directly result in downdrift erosion. I'm going to talk about longshore transport. That's what's causing downdrift erosion if it occurs. The second part is the geotextile tubes are there to avoid the periodic loss of sand from the bluff. And that bluff cannot be naturally rebuilt. The bluff is a glacial feature. So we're talking about a completely different geologic time frame. And then this canter will happen periodically on adjacent shorelines. When I say that the collapse of the bluff will happen and the recession of the bluff will happen on adjacent shorelines regardless of whether or not the geotextile tube is there. Because if it's just a little bit downdrift and you have a high water level, it will attack the base of the adjacent bluff. So let's move on to longshore transport. This is the north and south movement of sand. And as Dwight discussed earlier, you have sediment transport moving along Nantucket, tends to move to the ends, and the Sconset Bluff area tends to be a provider of that sediment. And that's why we have the sand mitigation, because we recognize that sand is provided by the bluff into the system, and we have to account for that. So what is longshore transport and why is this different? Well, it's driven by waves that are arriving at an angle to the beach. And so what you see here are the crests of several waves, and I've just drawn in some lines just to highlight those. And you can see that they come in at an angle to the shoreline. It is that angle to the shoreline that then moves the sediment in a longshore direction. So in this case, as you can see, the longshore transport would be from left to right. So it's this variation in the longshore transport that causes erosion and accretion. And so just kind of think of it like a piggy bank. If you put more into your piggy bank than you take out, then you get accretion, you make some money. If, on the other hand, you're taking more out of the piggy bank than you're putting in, then you get erosion. And this will happen along the shoreline. Different sections of the shoreline will either gain or lose sand at different rates, and that will depend upon the wave climate, because the wave climate is not necessarily uniform along that entire section of shoreline. It just so happens, and it's not coincidence, that the Geotextile 2 project is in an area that has a naturally higher erosion rate than areas to the north and south, because it also has a higher shoreline recession rate. So another portion of what drives longshore transport, really what we look at is what's the wave height, what's the wave angle, what's the wave period, the grain size of the beach, as well as the offshore beach slope. So these are just some of the contributing factors that lead to longshore transport. So the next question is, where does this longshore transport occur? And this is very important. The majority of your longshore transport is occurring what we call in the breaker zone. And this actually is a little bit off of seaward of your mean high water. And those waves start to feel bottom and they break offshore. You also have what we call the swash zone. So after the wave breaks, the water then runs up the face of the beach, and we call that the swash zone. So what this graphic is showing is that the majority of your longshore transport is occurring in the wave breaking zone. And I don't want you to focus on the numbers. This was, as you can see, taken from Pilkington 2007. What I'm trying to get over is that the largest curve you're seeing there, the significant wave height of 5 meters, provides the largest amount of longshore transport. That's the value on the y-axis. So the larger the wave, the more longshore transport you get. It's pretty obvious, I would guess. The other element, though, is when you have larger waves, they're breaking offshore, and they break further offshore. So you actually have the majority of your transport occurring offshore and not in the swash zone. And that's really what I'm trying to illustrate with this graphic. And so the second portion of that is in the swash zone, where you have now the wave is broken, the water runs up the face of the beach, and then as it comes back down the face of the beach, it will start to pull some of that sand with it. So what is, again, the relevance, and why are we going through this? So sand is not transported longshore at the highest elevations along the beach face. It's actually when you get into a little bit further offshore and into the bar system where those waves are breaking. The sand is also primarily within the wave breaking zone, but secondarily as that run up. And the run up is a lot of the time when we're talking about the geotubes, we're talking about run up. The wave breaking zone will start to get closer to the geotubes during a large storm event, but you're still looking at run up as being a secondary component. It will pull sand off the face of the geotubes into the system and then move it along shore. So once there's sufficient sand in the system as a whole, and that really is the key here, if you can put enough sand in the system, then you will have that previous natural rate of a longshore transport. That's going to be one of the key take-home messages from this. So I'm going to move on to diffusion. Now, diffusion is a form of longshore transport in terms of it moves the sediment to the north and to the south. And what causes diffusion is essentially a bump, or what we call a perturbation in the shoreline. Because you've placed sand a little bit further out or a little bit higher than the adjacent beaches, that sand will tend to move into those areas. It's a little bit like heat. You know, heat moves from a hotter area to a colder area. Well, it's a similar concept with sand. And the reason this is important is that if you put excess sand into the system, or you put a little bit further out, as we're doing in the geotube system, then that will increase the movement of that sediment to the adjacent shorelines. And when you look at the data that Dwight presented earlier, and you look at Woods Hole Group's data, what you're seeing is immediately adjacent to the project, you are seeing that sand essentially moving into that area. And when you compare it to the background erosion rates, it's a little bit lower. And so you can attribute some of that to the diffusion process. Now, I will say it's smaller. We have a small offset. We have a relatively short length and a large wave climate. And so the diffusion is pretty quick. And it is a difficult element to pull out within the full data set. But it is a process that we know should be occurring simply because we are placing sand a little bit further out than the adjacent beaches. And what that does is it increases the longshore distribution of sand that is being placed. So, in summary, the sand from the higher portions of the bluff are being pulled to the lower sections of the beach profile in a cross-shore transport and then being moved along shore. So essentially you have it coming down the face of the bluff, the face of the geotube, into the surf zone, and then being transported along shore. By SBPF overfilling in front of the geotextile tubes, essentially you're putting that additional system or additional sand into the system and then moving it along shore. The other critical element here, and I know this has been a topic of discussion, is, well, what happens during a large storm event and the geotextile tube becomes uncovered? Well, you're starting to move some of that sand from the geotextile, in front of the geotextile tube system during the storm event. But even before the storm event, you have taken some sand and pre-positioned it to the ends of the geotextile system. And so that sand is already in the system and contributing to the system as a whole. So it's not necessarily that you can focus on what's happening on a given hour within a storm event. You have to look at the system as a whole and where that volume is. And that really is why you look at the mitigation volume and say, is the mitigation volume working? And you look at the data and say, okay, adjacent to project areas, we are seeing additional sand in the system above what was there from the background system. So with that, I will turn it over to Les to talk about that sand mitigation.
Thank you. Hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm Les Smith from Epsilon Associates. I think those of you who were at our last meeting, you probably heard me before. Today I'm going to be talking about sand mitigation. And these identify the several different topics under sand mitigation that we'll be addressing. First is the mitigation requirement that is in the performance standards or the regulations. We'll look at some beach profile surveys that have been taken, and then some bathymetry profile surveys that go out beyond the nearshore. And then we'll be looking at some nearshore cobble and boulder surveys that we've taken. And then we'll talk a little bit about the sand source for the project. Next. Okay, this talks about the performance standards in the coastal wetland regulations under coastal bank, section 1033. And basically it indicates that the coastal engineering structural modification should be designed so as to minimize using best available measures adverse effects on adjacent or nearby coastal beaches. And our project complies because we've incorporated sand mitigation into the design, and it is a best available measure. You can see the sand mitigation volume in here that we're placing. Next please. What does best available measure mean? It's defined in the regulations as the most up-to-date technology or the best design measures or engineering practices that have been developed and that are commercially available. So in our notice of intent and our last CONCOM meeting, we reviewed the extensive alternatives analysis that we conducted for the project over the last 20 years, actually evaluated and some were constructed to demonstrate that the proposed project meets this definition of the best available measure. Okay, next we're looking at continuation of that coastal bank performance standard. And in terms of sand mitigation here at the project site, we look at the project length, the project height, and the retreat rate to calculate sediment contribution. And when we calculate it here, project length of 2,800 plus feet, a height of 74 feet, retreat rate of 2.8 feet, we got a bank contribution rate of 7.7 cubic yards per linear feet per year. Next, please. The project length is reflected here, 1878 feet down here at the south, 895 feet here to get that total length. Next. And the project height here is reflected by looking at all the lots within the project area, and we get an average of 74 feet for our average bank height. So that allows us to calculate the annual retreat rate. And the retreat rate that we calculated using these two different areas, the north and the south, gives us a retreat rate of 2.8 feet per year. Next, please. So in terms of our mitigation requirement continuing, in our particular project, we have greater sand volume with this project. Sand is eroded from the template during coastal storms, and the sediment is transported along the shore, making this available to the regional Sconset Little Drift system at a greater volume than would be available without the project. And this provides the interest of storm damage prevention and flood control, which is the interest under the Wetlands Protection Act that we're trying to provide here. And then we also are providing a bulldozer that speeds the geotube recovery. This is going to be provided by SBPF funding the use of a project-dedicated bulldozer so that sand can be moved to cover the exposed geotubes as quickly as possible after a coastal storm. So this is a new proposal that we're coming forth with. Next, please. Now, taking a look at the Nantucket Mitigation Requirement under 205B1, we basically are seeing that you want us to look at that no other alternative exists to protect the structure than what we've looked at here. And as we indicated, we've gone through our alternatives analysis, previously reviewed that with you. The project protects Baxter Road and public infrastructure, such as the bank walkway. And the project protects the entire historic, largely pre-78 community, which includes some pre-78 homes and some post-78 homes. Next, please. Now, your performance standard B3 indicates no adverse effects on bank height, stability, and sediment sources. Clearly, we're going to be preserving the bank height rather than harming it. We'll be enhancing the bank stability, and we'll be providing a sediment source by providing that sediment template, and we'll be monitoring adjacent and downdrift beaches. Next, please. Now, looking at Mass Coastal Zone Management, their coastal policy, hazard policy 1, indicates that you have to preserve, protect, restore, and enhance the beneficial functions of storm damage prevention and flood control. Again, those interests in the Wetlands Protection Act on various coastal landforms such as dunes, beaches, coastal banks, land subject to coastal storm flowage, etc. Now, in taking a look at that with this project, we see, again, it's the only feasible alternative, and that compatible sediment must be periodically placed into the Littoral Drift system. It doesn't indicate that it has to be placed at a specific time, but periodically placed in the Littoral Drift system to compensate for the sediment that's lost. Next. Continuing on with that policy, CZM wants you to calculate the long-term average, but the short-term rates can also be considered if the issuing authority determines that the short-term rate is more indicative of the current and future conditions. Our proposed project has calculated long-term rates, but we're also using the site-specific rates as they've changed in this project. Now, for mitigating the existing project, we again have calculated the sediment contribution rate for the bank at the existing project site. We found it to be 12 to 14.3 cubic yards per linear feet per year for pre-construction condition. However, we're placing 22 cubic yards per linear feet into the system. Our existing sand template contributed an average of 13.5 cubic yards per linear feet over this time frame, which is generally consistent with the pre-construction conditions. However, this 3-year period does not include the initial construction volume and better represents the average annual template maintenance volume, which in 2016 was 11.3 cubic yards per linear feet. It was decreased in 2017 to 8.9 cubic yards per linear feet, then increased in 2018 to 20.3 cubic yards per linear feet. So you can see it is variable from year to year. The problem is that the annual placement of 22 cubic yards per linear feet leaves a significant volume of sand in the template at the end of each season. This creates an over-steepened, top-heavy bank, which is really an unsafe condition. And it's very difficult to work with since it's so steep in that area. Next, please. So for our proposed project, again, here are the various input into calculating the sediment contribution rate that I reviewed previously. And when you look at that cubic yards per linear feet, that translates to 22,122 cubic yards per year over the project area. This correlates to, we're using a 22 cubic yards per linear feet per year, correlates to 63,206 cubic yards per year, which is 2.9 times that calculated sediment contribution rate for our coastal bank. Our proposed adaptive template management plan refills the template to 22 cubic yards per linear feet before the storm season. Next, please. So our adaptive approach, in the beginning of the storm season, we fill the template with that 22 cubic yards per linear feet. After the storm erosion, we replenish it over the geotubes with sand from the template. We use that dedicated bulldozer. Within 10 business days is the time frame that we're working with to replace the sand over the geotubes and using that dedicated bulldozer that I mentioned earlier. This adaptive approach is preferred because it avoids overfilling the template, which causes the covering existing vegetation, causing that oversteepened upper bank, which is a safety problem. And it's very difficult for pedestrian and vehicular access and for template management. Now, in terms of other projects, Woods Hole Group, in their report that we include as attachment E to the NOI, entitled Supplemental Historic Analysis of Survey Data at Sconset, it was dated December 2016, they looked at different other projects with runoff conditions requiring sand mitigation. There were 10 of these projects, 2 on Nantucket, beyond our project, 1 on Martha's Vineyard, and 7 on Cape Cod. They cover the time frame of 1986 to 2016. They involve both hard and soft engineering solutions. They involve shoreline reaches from 100 feet to 1,800 feet. So you can see our project is considerably longer than the typical projects they looked at. And they had mitigation volumes that were considerably less. They were 65 to 1,100 cubic yards per linear feet. Again, their volumes are based on the same calculation technique that we use here. But as you can see, those projects are much smaller, and the amount of mitigation is much, much less than what we're proposing here. And typically what they were doing was having a maximum of 1-to-1 mitigation as opposed to up to 2.9 times the rate here at Sconset. Now we're going to take a look at some beach profile surveys that were conducted by Woods Hole Group. This was again in their attachment E to the notice of intent. And we're looking at this project area here. Next, please. So we look at the project area here, and we're looking at data. The pre-geotube is in blue, and the post-geotube is in red. And we see the trends are very linear. We come down to this profile here, very linear trends here, both post and pre, very linear trend here. And basically what this is telling us is that there's a good correlation between the volume of sand between in the beach to mean low water and the shoreline position that we're measuring. So it's very indicative of what the volume is by doing these beach profiles. Next, please. Next, we're taking a look at the cumulative shoreline change. So we're looking at with time back here up to the present. And we're seeing this at profile 91, which is in the project area. It's over 20 years time frame. We see a net erosion of about 110 feet with time. Again, pre-geotubes in blue, post-geotubes in red. Since 2005, we have a long-term erosion with periodic accretion events going through this area here. And what we're seeing with the post-geotube, it's very, very similar to the overall trend. No market difference. Next, please. Now we move up to the Squam area, profile S. We see that we have a shoreline advance of about 30 feet since 1994. Quite variable and stable shoreline since 2007, hopping up and down, and similar in the post-geotube. So very similar to the overall trend that we're seeing. Next, please. Then we take a ride down to Codfish Park. And back in the late 1900s, late 1999, excuse me, 2009, Codfish Park was being threatened. I actually was doing work for the town looking at Codfish Park Road because it was being threatened, and people getting pretty nervous down there. Shortly after I did the work with the town, look what happened. Large amount of accretion. And it's been fairly stable since the 2005 timeframe. It's gone up and down a little bit. And it's also been fairly stable in the post-geotube timeframe. Next, please. Now we take a look at beach profile surveys, kind of a summary of them all. These incorporate a number of different profiles with time. And you can see a lot of variability. 91 again is the middle of the project area, and then we look either side of the project area. And we see in the post is the post geotube down this, beyond this line here. We see it's very similar to the pre-geotube in terms of variability of data. And there's no evidence of increased erosion post-geotube exceeding historical observations. Next, please. Now I'm going to take a look at some bathymetry profile surveys, which go from mean low water seaward. And Woodsall Group, again, did these, and they went out to minus 40 feet. We first look at the project area since 2008. A very stable profile. You can see the not very large changes from year to year displayed in the bathymetry data. That's at the project area. Then again, next we go to Squam. Again, very stable profile with time. However, when we go to the next profile, which is Codfish Park, we see some dynamic shoal changes down here. So a lot of sediment influx into the system offshore. And this is offshore waves. We're looking at, what does that say, 4,000 feet?
Yeah.
So we have some big shoals offshore there at Codfish. And of course, we also saw the large change in shoreline position there at Codfish, and it's related to that sediment input into the overall system. Next one. So in terms of their findings, this is right out of their report. No statistically meaningful trend to the long-term shoreline changes. The present shoreline is similar in position to the shoreline position 8 to 10 years ago. And recent shoreline changes since the geotube installation showing similar patterns. And so they concluded that the geotube project influence is not significant and or the associated mitigation is effectively helping to maintain the coastal system. So that's a very important conclusion of their report. Next, please. Continuing on with their findings, I pointed out the strong correlation between shoreline position and volume. So when you look at the position of the shoreline out there, you have a pretty good idea what the volume of sand in the system is. Again, the bathymetry for offshore data was generally stable, other than down at Codfish Park, where we have that influx of sediment. The beach response, the last bullet, since geotubes were installed, is similar to past measured shoreline changes, suggesting that the sand volume required can be reduced to offset the long-term sand volume erosion rate in the project area. So they're actually recommending a reduction in volume, though we're not proposing a reduction in the template. But that was their suggestion. Please. And continuing with their findings, generally there have not been apparent adverse effects to adjacent coastal landforms since the placement of the project. Beach performance trends since the installation of geotubes are similar to historic trends. There's a large-scale natural variability, so they weren't able to quantitatively measure how the project is performed. However, it was pretty obvious that the project has not significantly caused impacts to the adjacent areas, and the mitigation has been effective. Next, please. Next, I want to take a look at some surveys that we did in the Cobble Boulder areas seaward of the profiles. And basically, this is work that Epsilon did in conjunction with CR Environmental out of Falmouth. And we did underwater video surveys in 2016, 17, and 2018. And then the 2018 report summarizes the results of 2018 and compared it with the 2016 and 2017 surveys. That report was presented to the Conservation Commission after each survey. Here's the vessel out there doing the work. And here's an example of what we're going to be looking at in terms of the video evidence. Next, please. So here's a shot of the track lines that were conducted. So an awful lot of video work offshore there. And they're going to be going out there in the near future when we get some decent weather to go out and do some more survey. Next one. So this shows the percent cobble boulder in the transect offshore in June of 2016. Just take a look at the overall trends, and I'm going to show you a couple of photographs. Next one. This is near shore, 200 feet from the beach in June of 2016. We see mostly sand in that area there, sand waves. Next, please. When we go offshore 700 feet, we're starting to see now some cobbles out in this area here. And this is the area that obviously we're most interested in making sure that we're not covering up boulders and vegetation in this area about 700 feet offshore. So we looked at 2016 and we'll look at subsequent slides going forward. Looking at the next year, June 2017, and not too different in terms of the distributions that we're looking at. Next, please. Nearshore, again, mostly sand. And then offshore, similar distribution of cobbles in that offshore area. And then moving up to the present, again, showing the distribution here. Next, please. See sand in the nearshore. And then offshore, actually very similar distribution we saw the previous two years. Next. So when we take a look at those three time frames, we really aren't seeing much change to the cobble boulder survey bottoms as a result of the project. So in terms of findings, continues to be significant natural variability of nearshore habitat. The boulder cobble habitat increases as you go farther offshore. We're still finding that high concentration offshore, in the same general areas. And our 2018 survey indicates that a productive widespread cobble boulder habitat continues to be located just offshore the geotubes, and there is no indication that habitat is being covered by sand mitigation. Next, please. Now, lastly, I'm going to talk about sand sources. Where are we going to get the sand? We're going to get it at island and offshore sand pits. In terms of sand mitigation,
You say offshore sand pits, or do you mean off-island sand pits?
I meant off island. Sorry, I misspoke.
Thank you.
Good pickup. Maybe offshore in the future, but right now we're looking at these sources. So in summary of the mitigation description, we comply with the Mass Wetlands Protection Act regulations and performance standards, and we're protecting the interests of storm damage prevention and flood control, which is the two public interests. It's really storm damage prevention for the most part, because flood, you're not receiving much in the way of flooding with the coastal bank area here. In terms of CZM, we meet the adaptive sand mitigation in coastal hazard policy 1 of CZM. In terms of our cobble boulder surveys, we showed that we are not harming the cobble boulder habitat offshore. And lastly, the sand mitigation volume each year will be based on the losses the previous year, basically filling that template. Thank you very much. Available for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Les. Just some quick technical wrap up before before Stephen makes some final closing remarks. A lot of technical information provided tonight, and just a quick summary. What Gordon presented, the two primary sediment transport mechanisms that we see here are cross-shore sediment transport and longshore. The existing project and the proposed expansion works with those systems to provide sand to the littoral system so that it's available to be translocated cross-shore and get it into the Swash Zone and into the Nearshore. Then it's available for the Longshore Transport. So the project has been designed, following those principles of coastal geology. A couple of other points that when we talk about the sand mitigation volume, there's a lot of numbers that's been thrown around for the projects and for this project. Before the pre-bluff loss rate or contribution rate being between 12 and 14 cubic yards per linear foot per year, the average length weighted average for the existing proposed expansion area being about 8 cubic yards per linear foot per year, 7.7. I don't think there's a need to keep debating those, because the project that's been proposed, the project that was authorized with the existing order of conditions in the sand mitigation protocol, calls for filling the template up to 22 cubic yards per linear foot per year. So that that exceeds what's been identified as the unprotected bluff volume rate, whether it be 14 or 7.7. So I think, in terms of getting to those details, the idea is to have the 22 there at each beginning of each storm season, and then to evaluate what that loss is and refill the template with that volume. And as we could see, for the 3 years of really kind of O&M period, it's been about 13.5 on average, 13.5 cubic yards per linear foot, with some variation there. So the idea is to manage the template in a manner that's consistent with the science and that would vary with the short-term rates. And relative to the interests of the Act, the project is designed to protect the interests of the Act and the interests of the bylaw. And in terms of the placement of the sand, the guidelines are to do it periodically. So again, the protocol is to provide it after erosion rates consistent with the current order, and to do it periodically per CCM guidance, and trying to get out there within the 10 business days after an erosion event, so that the tubes are covered and the sand is available for the next, to be contributed to the littoral system. So those are kind of the takeaways when it comes to looking at this project relative to conditioning and order of conditions for this project. And with that, I'd just like to let Stephen provide some closing remarks.
Thank you. What I like about this is usually I'm the one who's talking in technicalities, and this time I feel like I'm the most understandable one, maybe sometimes. The thing about this project is that there's people who want to try and cast it in a light of should you protect the bluff or these homes or not. And the reality is that there's a right to have a non-coastal engineering structure sort of without question, and the board has never really questioned that. And then there's also a right to have a coastal engineering structure if you're meeting those additional standards. And I think what we've done in the past couple of weeks is demonstrate both that we are meeting the guidelines, both state and local, for having a coastal engineering structure, that the coastal engineering structure has been designed to be both the least intrusive as possible and the most removable if necessary, that the question of whether or not we're providing the right kind of sand has been addressed in the sense that it's not about mimicking nature in a minute by minute, but rather because of how the littoral system works, how Gordon demonstrated that the key issue is to have the right sand in the amount of volume of sand in the right places, not necessarily in the right moment, because the moment of the storm is not the moment when the system is working in the way that Gordon explained. So I think we're providing the right volume of sand, and that the sand that's being provided is both sufficient to meet the standards and match what's being provided by nature in the unprotected areas, and also with a sufficient, a significant excess volume that would be either somewhere between 50% and 3 times more than what should be contributed in the annual year, so that there's a very heavy amount of conservative and available sand, given the necessity to either recover the tubes or in case of any large storm systems or anything like that. So we have met the legal standard. We're providing the right volume, and we're providing it in the best available way. So our intent next week is to take any questions that the commission might have and to respond to any further comments there would be, and to also propose a list of proposed findings and a list of proposed conditions, so that we could go through it and determine where the commission thinks there's any need for any further information or any further discussion based, specifically on where there's agreement or disagreement, as opposed to just sort of generally going back and forth about it. So I guess if there's any other information that the commission would like to see in advance of doing that, we're happy to have that made available. Thank you.
Actually, on that note, On one of the less was, and during your presentation, the, you mentioned the offshore sites that had a 1-to-1 mitigation, the 7 on the Cape, and I can't remember where the others were. Could we get a location for those sites? I mean, we have projects on the island here, we have 1-to-1 mitigation as well, but
That was included in the NOI as an
the
attachment.
locations are in that part.
Yes,
Okay,
that's part of
okay.
that report. But if you don't find it in there, let us know. We'll dig down and talk to Woods Hole
No,
Group
I'll
and
dig a
get the
little deeper. It
specifics.
was a long report.
Okay.
So, okay, I had another question, actually. Also, in your volumetric change presentation that you had done, Dwight, was that including the bluff in the volumetric change data, or was that just the beach?
That volumetric change data is what's available from, that's what Woods Hole Group measures in their cross sections. I would have to dig into the details to see how high up the bluff they go.
Yeah, I mean, my point being that to compare the change on a beach surface, obviously, with the bluff was two different.
Correct.
Okay, I like that. I personally
I
like
think
to
it's
know that.
primarily, they use the mean low water baseline, and then they work landward and seaward from that.
Okay. Okay. 'Cause I mean, a huge dynamic. Obviously, when you have some of those, I know there's a 5-year periods between those surveys, but when you have the end of a survey and it ending in a September, and you have another survey ending in December, you're going to have a big change. That was why I'm curious about that. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, since you're up there, I asked last time to actually have, what was the cubic yard calculation?
You gotta eat the
Sorry.
mic.
I asked last time how much sand was actually at the front of the template. In other words, how much sand would actually be available immediately in a storm situation. And I don't think we've been provided with that, have we?
The standard,
No.
the standards have about 2 feet of cover, 2 to 3 feet of cover over the tubes. So that's available at the beginning of the storm season, and then as those tubes get exposed, they get recovered again with that 2 to 3 feet. In terms of a storm by storm, we can look at the storm reports, which give estimates of those volumes, and then the annual surveys give the overall volume that was contributed for the storm season. And as was mentioned, we had, I don't have the slide up, but has the 3 years of basically the O&M, that averaged about 13.5 cubic yards per linear foot, and that was being washed. That's what was coming off the template, which means that's what's going in front of the tubes, and then it's being washed offshore. So it's kind of working backwards to get to that answer.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess I have a question about your the sand template and the volume of sand in the right places. When I look at this, you've taken an average for the entire project area, and in reality, one end might be eroding at a slower rate than the other. So I'm wondering if we just have this average over the template, are we actually going to starve, I guess it would be the cross-shore sand that would eventually make it into the system on one end, because that's an average and it's not meeting the higher end, if you know what I mean. Like when I look at the south end of this project, there's almost a fully vegetated bluff. It looks pretty good, and the erosion rate I think is a little bit less there. So you would think that the template would require less if you were not doing averages.
And correct, and that's where the adaptive management protocol comes into play. Just what you're saying is, when we looked at one of the earlier slides that shows the project area in the kind of in the south, the two zones. One is the furthest south zone that still sees some vegetation on the bluff, and then between that point, which is about 67 Baxter Road up to the existing project, it's denuded, and then it's bare, heading north. So you're right that we are going to see north and south of the existing project, that unprotected bluff having different rates. The length weighted average is that 7.7 number that's shown there. But the adaptive template management is proposed, as I said, kind of the gas tank analogy, the car analogy, is at the beginning of the storm season to have that full, so that across the template, on average, there's 22 cubic yards per linear foot. Now, what's washed off the front of the tubes and needs to be replaced off the top of the template will vary from point to point. But as the bulldozer comes through and recovers those, that means that where the erosion, where more sand is lost off the front of the template, more sand is replaced. Where less is washed off the front of the template, less is replaced, so that we're getting that sand being recontributed to the littoral system, essentially where it's being lost on, you know, as you go along the template, not as opposed to saying we're going to put 7.7 in front of the template after every storm or something like that, or every year. This allows it to be adaptive so that those changes along the 4,000 feet are actually managed as opposed to being a uniform number. So we're trying to place that sand periodically as the, you know, and in the right place and in the right volume to match what was washed off the template, or washed off the front of the template.
Okay, and then since it's so adaptive, are you going to be able to keep like a data on how much you're adding to each area, or will that get lost along the whole project? Because I think that's important going forward. If we're
Yeah.
eroding more at one end, we need the data collected with how much more
Correct.
sand that's taking.
Right now, after an erosion event, there is an estimate of the volume of sand that's lost in an area where there's erosion. That protocol, you know, would continue. That after the erosion event, there'd be, okay, there was, you know, sand lost from, you know, X to Y Baxter Road. It was this, you know, this long, you know, it's this high, and it was, you know, 2 to 3 feet deep that was lost. So that volume can be, you know, extrapolated. It's not going to be a, you know, down to, you know, 0.0001 cubic yards, but it's going to be extrapolated so you can have an, you know, an idea as to where the sand is being lost after different storms. Because we expect, you know, depending on the storm, the direction of the waves, you know, as Gordon was mentioning with Longshore Transport, that's what kind of washes the sand either north or south, depending on the direction of the waves. With 4,000 feet, you know, it's going to be expected to occur in some places, but not in others.
Right.
At 900 feet, it's pretty short.
Right. So I guess maybe there could be a condition in place to monitor, you know, the areas, or somehow have quadrants or
Yep.
something.
And you know, I was going to say that the guys do, you know, document where the sand was lost and then what was placed in those areas, and you know that can be done probably most notably by, you know, what property along Baxter Road they're working behind.
Thank you.
Well, I have a comment or a question about the dozer. And I assume not only will you have a bulldozer on site ready to go, but you will also have at least one, if not more than one, qualified drivers on island during the storm season that are, I know they can't sit out in the dozer and be ready to go, but they have to be ready basically to drop everything no matter what. If their wife's having a baby, you know, that's why you need a backup, you know, to be out there and start working.
Sure. With that, I'll ask Jamie to, is this a quick comment on Ashley's line of questioning, then he can talk to you about the equipment operator.
Jamie Feely for the record. I just wanted to mention, Ashley, about your, so we do pre and post storm photographs as part of our reporting, and we take pictures from the same 4 spots each time, which gives you a pretty good visual of the entire face of the geotube. And so as far as did we lose sand on the north, south, or middle, that visually captures that pretty well, I think, on an ongoing basis, and we submit them to Jeff. So hopefully that addresses your concern, at least partly.
Yes, so you'll need more than 4 pictures with this big project.
No, obviously, we would adapt that for the larger project, but yeah, if we continue this reporting, I think that would do it. As far as the equipment operator, we do have a local operator that we've arranged to run this machine, Dan Baird. He's also a diesel mechanic, and so I don't anticipate getting an operator to be an issue here. And the machine is exclusively, I shouldn't say exclusively, but it's for this use. I don't anticipate us using it for any other projects. I don't want to rule that out if something came up, but its primary use and purposes for servicing this project.
One more related comment. First, I want to apologize for assuming it would be a he driving that machine. I should know better than that after listening to all this stuff that's going on these days. So, ladies, I'm sorry. It was
Don't forget the transsexuals.
Oh, well, yeah, whoever, drives that machine. Okay, and then what I'd like to see us do, or you guys do, is the initial covering. I'd like to see the sand all put on the top of the tubes, and we assume that they're nude because a big storm came by and the tubes are all empty like they were at the end of this spring. And then send the driver out there and see how long it actually takes to cover those tubes in a test run. And, if it takes a week, that's, I guess, what you're predicting. But if it takes longer, maybe he needs more, the driver, I did it again, needs more practice or whatever, because, like the last winter, we had bing, 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 storm after storm. Like every week we had a big event. And so that 6-day to 7-day period to get them covered again is not trivial.
Right.
And it's going to be a very long, if it's permitted, a very long project. So.
Right. That's why when in terms of the PowerPoint, things get a little abbreviated, but the written response is that the proposal is to get the bulldozer out there, get the sand, to recover the exposed areas within 10 business days. Now, there's a caveat in making sure that based on safe work conditions, because if there's storm after storm and that gets to be unsafe for the workers, then there would be consultation with the Conservation Commission, with Jeff, to explain the situation. But the idea is to get out there and to cover those exposed areas within the 10 business days after an erosion event. And Ashley, just one last thing in terms of the cross sections. There are a number of cross sections within the existing proposed area and within the existing project area and the expansion area that will be continued to be monitored by Woods Hole Group, so that some more accurate data can be established in terms of what those volumes are at those train sects.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Sure. Or Steve, do you want to? Okay. So, Mr. Solson, you used the expression overfilling and said that the sand is already in the system. But in fact, so I wonder if you could elaborate, because I didn't fully understand, because my understanding is that there has to be actual room between the geotubes and the coverage in the front and the high tide line. So, in other words, under pre-storm conditions, it's not, as from my point of view, in the system. And then during the storm, especially during a 3-day nor'easter, there's clearly no sand coming into the system from the project. So where is the sand which should have been coming in from the bluff coming from? And is it actually affecting the bluff upstream and downstream? So is the sand that isn't coming from the geotube front, is that actually coming from the rest of the bluff? Or in your estimation, is that being provided by the littoral system?
So when I say overfilling, you have the portion that's on the dry beach that on a day-to-day case is not being transported either across shore or longshore. However, when you overfill the system and you place more sand there, the mitigation volume being higher than what the background erosion rate is, you do end up moving that material offshore. And so you can essentially have a system whereby you have more sand in the offshore from, let's say, -5, -10, that is still in the system. So what that's doing is it's breaking waves a little bit further offshore. So that's what I mean by saying overfilling. You've shifted that shoreline a little bit further seaward by the placement of additional sand. So when Jamie goes and he places the sand and he bulldozes it down the face, and it's a little bit further seaward than it would be, when those waves come in, they will remove some of that sand and pull it offshore in kind of a smaller event that you might not necessarily see how that whole beach is interacting. But the sand is still there, it's just a little bit further offshore. And that's why this concept of understanding the cross-shore transport is important. So I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question on that just by the look on your face. Does that kind of make sense?
You haven't answered what happens. Where does the sand come from when there's no sand being provided by the geotubes, during a 3-day nor'easter?
So when you're saying when the sand, so the sand has covered the geotubes at the beginning of the nor'easter, it will then move offshore. As the waves come in, they break offshore. You have the Swash Zone. Some of that will start to pull some of that sand off the face of the geotube. It will continue to provide sediment into the system, and then it will move in a longshore direction. I guess what your question is let's say halfway through the storm, you have a portion of the geotube that has become exposed and therefore is not providing sand into the system. Where does that sand come from? That's where you get into the overfilling portion of I've placed more sand before the storm event. It has worked its way downdrift, or it has worked its way offshore. It's still volume that is within that total system. So even though the geotube may prevent a cubic yard per linear foot of erosion, you've already provided 2 cubic yards per linear foot of fill before that storm event has come in. And that sand is still within the system, acting to dissipate wave energy and put sand into the system. So that's what I mean by overfilling, is you might not have it there for the last hour or couple hours of a storm, but you've got more sand in the system to begin with than you otherwise would have. And so that's when you get into the mitigation. To me, what I would call mitigation is the above and beyond of the sand that would have been coming from the bluff without the project.
I think a big...
Please follow up if I can kind of...
Well, I mean, you clearly, if the geotubes weren't there, in the third day, in the final day of the fetch from the nor'easter, it would be pounding away at the bluff, and chunks of the bluff would be falling in. So, in other words, that sand that would otherwise be coming from the bluff isn't coming into the system. And I've seen up to 15 feet taken off the bluff during a 3-day nor'easter in the past. So, and I noticed that your figures, from 94 to present is 110 feet roughly. But if you go from 74 to 94, I bet you that it's closer to 150. So, there was a period when there weren't 3-day nor'easters, and so much less was being taken out of the bluff. So from a layman's point of view, the geotubes are not providing the necessary amount of sand, even though you say that it's been provided in advance, in a sense, from your technical definition.
So I definitely look at it with respect to the total volume of sand that is within the system. What I would categorize this system as is a last line of defense. Your geotubes are a last line of defense before your bluff starts to recede and you start to undermine the buildings and have to remove them. Typically under a last line of defense type of system, you offset the sand that would have been contributed to the system and you put that in front of the geotube system or whatever your coastal engineering design is. And you look at that from a total volumetric sense and say, this is what it has historically provided, and this is what you are currently providing. And if you over provide sediment between those storm events and you move the shoreline a little bit further out, or you provide sand to the adjacent properties because you have protected your own property, but you want to make sure you're not impacting your neighbors. If you've provided them additional sand before that event occurs, then essentially you're saying, I have offset some of the impact. We're not saying that the adjacent shorelines won't get impacted. They would have been impacted with or without the project. What you're doing is you're mitigating the impact that your project has had on those adjacent sections. So by providing sand to those adjacent areas before the storm comes in, you're essentially trying to limit what that impact will be during the storm event. There is somewhat of a time lag, and if we take it to the extreme, if you put a grain of sand in the middle of the project area, it will take several years for it to get to the far end of the island, up to North Point. So what you're trying to do is put sand into the system in advance of the storm event, and some of that sand will move its way adjacent to the property, or adjacent to the project, to adjacent properties, and therefore assist them during a storm event so that they are not getting impacted if the geotubes do become exposed. So essentially you move it offshore, then you move it alongshore. Well, if you've already moved some of that sand alongshore before the storm event, if you have some of that cross-shore movement being impacted because of the geotube stopping it, you still have the adjacent property has been provided sediment before the storm event.
Thank you.
So along that point, this whole thing started the year of, it was Sandy. I think Sandy came through and then 2 nor'easters followed, if I remember right. And I remember the number 30 foot of bank was lost, 30 foot of bank. So if you do the math, 27 cubic feet in a cubic yard, if you lose 27 feet of bank, then you lose a cubic yard for every foot of bank elevation. That means if you have an average bank height of 60 feet, you're losing on average 60 cubic yards per linear foot of sand. That's an awful lot of sand to have stored offshore somewhere or stored anywhere. And that's the big concern, is these big events. And that's, what our concern was this winter, was when the big events were coming through, those tubes were bare and they were contributing nothing, when we should have seen some big losses and big contributions, and we weren't. And so one of my big concerns with the existing project, and if it's going to be the same, the future project, is it's like you say, you tend to lose too much in an average year, but you don't have near enough out there for a storm year. So you need to, you put in 22 cubic yards per foot, and you get that big year of losing more than 60 foot per, 60 yards per foot. You've got about 5 years of, 3 or 4 years of sand you have to pile on there to be ready to lose in that 1 year.
And what we're looking at is providing enough on a yearly basis is what the regulations really focus on. And we're looking at average rates. And when you look at them over several years, you provide enough for those type of major storms. And that's what the regulations require. That's what all the projects that Woods Hole Group cited in their report, the other 10 projects. Those are only put out, those volumes are only put out once a year. We're providing a much more adaptive nourishment program than any of those other projects that are out there.
Les, the regulations also say no adverse impact, and Ernie's point is that
they say
major storms,
minimize adverse impacts is what they say. And I think that's what we're proposing to do here. And again, if you take a look at the volumetric changes that we have been measuring for the existing project, we're finding that the project is not causing adverse impacts. And we're anticipating that that'll be even less so going forward, because these areas have much less in the way of erosion rate than the existing project area. We're providing almost 3 times as much volume of sand as would naturally be available. And again, also those volumes of sediment that are contributed from the natural bank, there is a significant amount of that sediment that is not really compatible. There's a lot of fine-grained material that gets washed away. What we're providing is almost 100% compatible. So it's a big difference that way as well. So we really are overfilling the system with compatible sediment.
So I just have a comment about the compatible sediment. Although it might be better for beaches, some of those fine silts and clay particles are better for the ecosystems offshore. So it depends on what you're looking at for those grain sizes.
That is not the way we're looking at it in terms of storm damage prevention and flood control, which is the interest of the Wetlands Protection Act that we're providing here. We're looking at how it provides storm damage prevention, and that's really a volumetric
Right, but when we're looking
analysis.
at impacts to our resource areas and the ecosystems there are also something that we would look at.
Yeah, can I just make a quick comment on some of these points? Just doesn't want to tighten up. Number one is, when we look at the last 3 years, we saw variations in the amount of sand per linear foot that was contributed off the template, and that varies. This past year, which was a highly energetic storm season, we saw 20 cubic yards per linear foot. The current order of conditions in the proposed project proposes to have more than that on the template available to be, there to recover exposed tubes at the beginning of each storm season. So we're seeing that there is variation in the volume that's being provided is there that can accommodate the losses over the course of a season. Another point in terms of what we saw, I was going to go through back to what has the reproduction of the table 2 from the Woods Hole project report, the 77th report. But when we look at that, we see that for this past storm season, and it's provided with the materials that were submitted on Friday, that for this past year, when we sum all of the stations that are within the existing project area, the existing notice of intent project area that extends, the full 4,000 feet, there is a net increase in the volume as the sum of those transects from September of 18 to August of 17, and that included the storm seasons for this past winter. So in terms of that length, the 900 feet plus the 900 and the 2,000, that whole area, based on the sum of those transects, there's increase in the volume along the shoreline. And lastly, in terms of the grain size analysis, the samples that I have looked at as part of this project, and then what get forwarded on to Jeff, we are looking at compatible grain size. The grain size that's identified by Dr. Rosen has a medium to coarser grain size. So that's what is looked for to make sure that that's in the sample. But in reality, there's also fines that are in there. And so, there is a gradation of sand sizes that are in those samples and in the sand that's being placed. But we want to make sure the majority of it's the medium to coarse grain sand, but there's still some fine sands in there too, which provides some heterogeneity to the sediment that's being washed out into the nearshore system.
So I have a question about the sediments in the sand. And so when we stipulated in the original NOI that it be similar grain size, we clearly didn't cover other aspects because certainly to my untutored eye, the fill provided looks absolutely nothing like what's on the beach. And so I'm wondering, I don't know if there's been an analysis that has gone beyond grain size. Do you know if there has been, Jeff? of the fill because,
Mineral analysis?
yeah, or, I mean, and there's no cobble coming. I mean, it looks so different to my eye to what is actually in the bluff, as I'm sort of astonished that it can be claimed that it's sort of acceptable. And so please, please teach me where I'm making a mistake here.
It's been evaluated for grain size, so compatible in terms of the grain size analysis. And the monitoring that's being done is less reviewed. There's a concern that for the existing project, the 900-foot project, that there was 12 to 14 cubic yards off the bluff before the project, and the idea that there's 22. So part of the monitoring for that cobble habitat is to make sure that that excess sand that's available to be put into the system isn't adversely affecting those areas. And from the monitoring, we're seeing that, we're still getting about the same cobble habitat areas out there. So we're not seeing that this sand is migrating out and covering those areas, so there's a loss of cobble.
Well, I do have a question about the transects, actually, because I didn't really understand if you could go to page 84 or on here, that it says that
Before we jump on to the next one, I just wanted to comment on the coloration, Ian, that you're bringing up. And I'm not saying that this is the only, cause perhaps, but when there's fines in the sand that's being delivered, when we bring the trucks in, it is more of a brownish color than what's on the template or what's on the beach, because what's on the beach has obviously been washed by the water. And then what's on the template is eventually exposed to a whole bunch of rain, and I just feel like, that's washing the fines away that are part of what's coming out of the dump truck that's coming out of the pit. So, I've been watching for 5 years, and when it comes over the edge of the bluff, it does always have a darker coloration than what's on the beach. So that would be my explanation.
Thank you. Thank you. So it says transects 92.5 and 90.6 were not video drift transects. What does that mean? Right here in the bottom right-hand corner. Oh, here, let me lend you my glasses.
Which was that again?
It says transects 92.5 and 90.6, which are the north and south transects. We're not video drift transects.
Correct.
So does that mean there weren't pictures taken there, or?
Yeah, those are the Woods Hole Group transects. So those are used to position, to put these video transects in relative to the shoreline, so you can know where they are relative to the shoreline.
Got you. So
those are baseline. Those are baseline transects by Woods Hole Group, so that you know where it is from year to year, where your actual video transects are performed.
So the video points are the ones, the three lines in the middle there.
Right, the squiggly ones.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So was there any change at all over the years that they've been videoed?
Again, there was variability, but it was very similar. Very similar in terms of the cobble percentage offshore.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question on that same line.
That's why we added that one, so you can see the blue is about 50 to 60%, and so you can see it's staying pretty consistent from year to year, is the percent cobble.
Thank you.
I was curious, Wes, about, I would think given the Longshore Transport that most of this, I brought this up at one of the meetings way back, that the Longshore Transport would be taking all the sediment pretty much left and right. It wouldn't, north and south, it wouldn't necessarily be going straight out given the current along the shore there. And I know we didn't specify transects farther down the beach, but wouldn't you think that farther down north and south of the beach would be more realistic of the effects of the sediments being deposited out?
I think the largest impact would be, as Gordon pointed out, by diffusion. You want to speak to that in terms of diffusion right off of the project area?
Can you just clarify? Are you talking about the material going straight offshore and causing
I mean,
coverage,
we're
or are you
looking at-
talking about going north and south?
Well, it's what I'm saying is that it seems to me, given the longshore transport, that the sediment coming off this project isn't necessarily going straight out. It's going north and south along the beach and then migrating its way out. So I would think just that the effect straight off the bank, off the project, would be minimal compared to where it would be farther along down the beach. I'm curious what your take on that statement.
You will have as I said, you can break this into two processes. So you have the cross-shore transport first, and then you have the longshore transport. And so you're going to end up with a mixture of those two. And so the volumes that you're talking about, because we're not drastically advancing the shoreline and just trying to essentially hold it where it's at, I think that the area that we're monitoring is appropriate. If we were advancing the shoreline, I think you'd see a lot more of the cross-shore portion first. Okay. The further you go north and south, the less you're going to get the cross-shore component showing up. So it's very much a three-dimensional kind of issue.
I guess what I'm saying is, are we missing something here by not surveying north and south?
I think we're capturing everything possible that's going cross-shore. Longshore, I don't think you're going to see as much because in the area that you're dealing, when you get further north and south, you're going to be closer to the shoreline. And therefore you're going to be in the area that has inherently a sandier composition. So you're probably not going to pick up as much change. If that makes sense.
Right. So basically you're saying that most of this material, when it heads offshore, when it's in the longshore drift, is heading off of like the sewer beds or end of Great Point by the original photographs. I mean, it's basically heading out at those points. It's not heading out, you don't think?
Yeah,
earlier.
it's going to be contained a little bit closer to the shoreline, but the volumes and the changes that we're talking about are relatively small. You're talking 22 cubic yards per linear foot. And given the time period, you're not talking a really big seaward shift of your shoreline. I think the natural variability of what you're getting overwhelms the impact of what you're seeing from the placement of that sediment. It's probably the better way to characterize it.
Okay.
And if you remember, I did show the profiles offshore and down at Squam and at Codfish Park. And clearly here and at Squam, we're seeing pretty similar bathymetry as you go further offshore. So we're not seeing an awful lot of sand going off in that direction. It was really Codfish Park where we saw those offshore shoals, and that's unrelated to what we're doing here. There's a lot of other things happening down in Codfish.
Right.
Just thinking logically, also you've taken a volume and now you're looking at an area, width area off the shore. And then as you start expanding that longitudinally, now you have a much larger area. So that same volume becomes a very thin depositional. So, I mean, it's not the same type of diffusion that I don't think that Gordon's talking about, but just, thinking about, chemical diffusion type things, it's going to get to be a lower and lower concentration. So therefore, just less sand that you're going to see further north and south as you continue in those directions.
Okay. Thank you.
So I have a question about the swash zone and break zone and how the swash zone might change with exposed geotubes, because if you have exposed geotubes, you have the wave velocity that's just going to reflect back. You're not going to disperse a lot of that velocity or diminish it as it moves. So how does that affect the swash zone? Does that make it larger and push the break zone further out? Or how does that all work with sand transport and wave energy?
The better way to look at this is to go back to the wave modeling, the cross-shore wave modeling that I discussed at the last presentation. So during a large storm event, what will happen is your breaker zone, as the waves come in and break, you pull the sediment offshore, which then actually causes your breaker zone to increase in width, because you essentially take this flatter or steeper section, you move it offshore, and so you end up with this bit of a flattening of the profile, which increases your breaker zone. So the beach equilibrates to the energy that's impacting it. If you have the geotubes, if the geotubes become exposed, you will have run up on the geotube, and it's just dissipating energy at that point. And then, per what we were showing in the modeling, you pull some of that sand offshore. So you pull the sand offshore, and as you pull that sand offshore and put it into a bit more of the breaker zone, you then have that being transported in a longshore direction. So you have the waves coming in at an angle that are pushing the sand alongshore, as well as the cross-shore redistribution of sediment. So that's why you end up with kind of what I call the winter and summer profile. Right. Is during the winter profile, which is just more storm events, you get the sand getting pulled offshore, and that will push the breaker zone a little bit further out. And so you have a longer range over which those waves are breaking. Is that?
Yeah, I understand. I just don't. This area doesn't have the sandbars and the break zone that typical beaches have. So I'm just wondering if then, since you're hitting these geotubes, is the sand then further off the shoreline than it would normally be? Because in the swash zone, you're hitting a hard surface and coming back? Or like, how does that impact the larger system?
Okay. A better way to look at that is what we would term reflection, wave reflection. Within the modeling that we did, we can set the model up to include wave reflection. The beneficial portion of having a geotube is it's somewhat curved, which doesn't have as much wave reflection as if you were to have a vertical bulkhead or seawall. So even though you do have, if any reflection will start to pull some more of that sand offshore. And that's what we were finding within the modeling effort, is when we were showing deflation of the profile and exposure of the geotubes under a 100-year storm event. That's what we're seeing is the sand will get moved offshore, and that's when it will then get moved in a longshore direction. But you're seeing more of that longshore transport then occur further out than right up against the geotubes.
But as a practical result, correct me if I'm wrong, during the storm, you get a smaller swash zone in front of the geotubes as opposed to where the N Scour is taking place and where the bluff, because the geotubes are sticking out further than the bluff on either side. So that swash zone is reduced, right?
Well, your swash zone, the volume of sediment being moved in a longshore direction in the swash zone where you just have the run up and run down is smaller than your wave breaker zone where you have the waves breaking a little further offshore. That's where the bulk of your sediment transport, longshore sediment transport, is occurring, which is why I showed that graphic with the large curve, which is a little further out. So that really is what you're looking to do, is you transport the sediment offshore. There's more sand in the offshore area. The waves are breaking a little bit further out, even as they get bigger as the storm comes in. They're breaking further out and then transporting the sand alongshore.
Well, one of the reasons I brought it up is because I have some questions about the benthic habitat. And I don't know, is this the hearing that we should ask that, or wait till the next one?
I think if you want to ask it, maybe something that's going to be covered under the next one, because I know wildlife habitat is one of the topics for next time.
Okay, so I'll wait till next time then.
I'd say if you have it, you can throw it out there and they can at least know what the question is.
So in the NOI of September 30th, 2015, Condition 11 started off, the Commission finds that the presence of benthic invertebrate and microorganisms, I can't even read my handwriting, excuse me, within the beach is important, obviously, as a habitat. But in Condition 29, for asking for annual assessments, it included habitat and substrate sampling and invertebrate sampling. So I then go to the 2016 report, and it turns out that in Attachment D, which is the intertidal benthic invertebrate sampling, there was a 1 millimeter sieve was used. So my understanding, and of course, I'm not a biologist, so this is strictly from what I've been reading, and forgive me if I'm really, asking the wrong questions here, but I don't understand why there wasn't a 45 micrometer sieve used for meiofauna, because from what I read, meiofauna go right through a 1 millimeter sieve. That's what's used for macrofauna, and meiofauna, of course, are really the basis for a benthic habitat at one level, and a very important marker from what I read. And then in 2017, in the annual report, there was no attachment of benthic sampling and only a single reference to beach invertebrates. And so I'm wondering what happened. So I guess that is something to chew on. And because I thought we were going to get, I mean, my caveat is that I'm very impressed by what SBPF has provided for the Commission in terms of scientific data. And so that, when we had the NOI in 2015, I was hoping that also we'd get data on meiofauna as well as macrofauna. That somehow seems to have slipped through the, if I may say, through the sieve. So
we'll check that out and,
Thank you.
report at the next hearing. One question that I just want to try to clarify, Ashley, maybe Gordon can talk about it qualitatively at least, is the idea of reflection. Obviously we're looking at the expansion, extending the tubes out. As Gordon mentioned, reflection, part of the variable is the angle of the slope, and just the question of a more steepened bluff face, does that have a different magnitude of reflection than the sloped geotubes when they're exposed?
Okay, so if you stack the geotubes and you have less overlap, you're going to get more reflection off of that. So there's a balancing act between stacking the tubes, and in some instances you can make that the overlap almost 100% so that you have a face that's near vertical. In this case, the geotubes are stepped back with a 7-foot gap between them to give you more of a beach slope that can act to reduce wave reflection and dissipate the wave energy. To where Dwight's going with the question of the bluff tends to be in an oversteepened condition when you have waves impacting right against the bottom of it. And depending on the type of material and what we call the consolidation of the material, you can actually get wave reflection set up against that. So if you look at, for example, the clay face,
Right, that's a hard.
that's very hard, you can get a lot of reflection off of that clay face. In other areas, you might have material that's very soft and porous and might be absorbing some of that wave energy. The catch on that side is if it's absorbing that wave energy, and it's likely then just going to be pulled back out within that swash zone area. So does that answer a little bit of your question between the geotube being vertical as well as the bluff face and the the type of material within that bluff.
Yeah, I think the majority of the bluff, I mean, there's a few clay deposits in there, but it's mostly unconsolidated. I mean, I've gone in and felt that,
Yeah.
and when the geotubes were exposed, I might have touched them a little to see how solid are these things. So I know they're hard as a rock, you know, versus the bluff that's really not so much. Yeah, but they're so tall that, yes, it's angled, but depending on how the wave's hitting.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variability involved with that with respect to what portion of the geotube is exposed. If it's the bottom of the geotube, then you might get more reflection. If it's just the top portion of the geotube where it's curved, you might actually get run up over that geotube, and you start to pull some of the sandy material that's there back into the swash zone. So a lot of it will just depend on what tidal cycle the storm's coming in at, what the wave elevations are, and what your beach slope is in that particular storm event, which will be different simply because you end up with a different wave angle, you end up with a different wave height, you end up with a different water level, you end up with a different wave period. All of those elements will interact to give you a difference in how that beach is performing within the storm event.
Sort of along these lines, I'm kind of curious how N Scour works. What's the physics of N Scour? Is it an eddy effect? You know, if you have a wave moving down the face of the, say, the tubes in this case, and it gets to the end and it hits that place where there's no tube anymore, does it eddy and sort of swirl around back there and increase the erosion? Or if the wave, I can understand if the wave is coming into that end and hits the end, you know, if it's exposed and then it hits it, that it would, you know, reflect back into the bank more. But how does N Scour actually work? What's the physics going on there?
The lay answer is you're getting the eddying. I don't want to use the incorrect terms, but I'll ask Gordon or Les to give the more technical response. But as the energy kind of wraps around that end, it does create, you know, higher velocity, higher energy, and that's what causes then the N Scour. But I don't want to use the terms incorrectly, so.
When you get to the ends of coastal structures, there are several different elements that come into play. You end up with a process that we call diffraction, which is you have a hard portion and then a wave essentially is bending around it. You might see this out, if you're flying anywhere, you're flying to Boston, you'll see kind of a rock outcrop way out in the ocean, you'll see waves bending around it. That can be diffraction, which is the hard structure. You also end up with what's called refraction, which is due to the bathymetry, which will bend the waves coming in. In what you're talking about, it's less of a refraction issue and more of a diffraction issue. And that diffraction will end up with, yes, some edging occurring and pulling sediment out of the system. For SBPF, and this is a portion of why the ends are filled. So when Jamie goes out there, he's placing a bit more sediment out there to offset some of that effect. But it is a relatively localized effect. And that's why you also have what we call the returns. So the returns go in at an angle for exactly that reason. So that you can minimize what that effect is beyond the return. So once you get beyond the return feature, those eddies tend to abate and you get back to, well, not get back to, unfortunately, you end up with the storms impacting on the adjacent bluff that's unprotected.
So it's basic fluid dynamics.
Yes, and there have been a lot of PhD theses about figuring all that stuff out. Yep.
So leading from N Scour to Littoral Drift, could we see page 11, please? On the So on the west side of Great Point there, where the sandbar goes out,
Yep.
I think that's the deepest spot in the sound at over 50 feet. and then you go, when you take your boat across, you go from 50 feet to you have to watch out that you don't actually ground on the sandbar there. So is that N Scour on a grand scale?
No. What you're looking at there is a tidal interaction. So that is a completely tidally driven, well, I shouldn't say completely because there's a longshore component of it, but it's the longshore component that's sweeping the sediment to the north, and then the reason for that that bar feature is completely tidal.
Okay.
So it's not a scouring effect, it is a tidal effect.
So how do you calculate littoral drift or littoral drift, however you pronounce it? In other words, you don't use radioisotopes with sand. So how do you actually make the calculation of how much sand is going either direction?
There are many different ways you can do that. One common mechanism is you break your shoreline into pieces, and you take profiles, much as we're doing at Sconset, and you figure out what your volumetric change is on each one of those individual slices. And then what you do is you try and figure out where you might have what we call a nodal point, which is a point of zero net longshore transport. Not that there's not transport going north and south, but if you average it over whatever time period you're looking at, it's a net no longshore transport. Then what you do is you sum them up, going up in either direction, and you come up with an estimate of what your total volumetric losses are, and that will give you an indication of what your longshore transport rates are. The other mechanism you can look at is taking something like that, and if you have bathymetric surveys over many, many years, you can then start to compare what your bathymetric changes are, sum up that bathymetric change, and that will give you what your longshore transport is at the end. The other option you've got is you go out and you put a groin structure in, not saying you put a groin in, but you find where you have a groin-like structure, so a shore perpendicular structure. And again, you do surveys and you figure out, okay, I've got a certain volume, a volumetric change, and I know that when I put that structure in, the shoreline was uniform, or just before I put it in, it was uniform. I put it in, and it's built within a certain amount of time, and that will give you an estimate for what your longshore transport rate is. At Sconset, it's the first one.
Got you. Okay. So it's not putting a bucket into the water and counting the grains.
Yeah, people have done that. The problem is it's never uniform. So that's why when we develop longshore transport rates, we generally only ever say it's a certain volume per year, and even then we try and look at much longer time periods because the variability within any given between years and even within the year can be quite substantial. You can see reversals where even along Sconset you will see net sediment transport going to the south, gross sediment transport going to the south, but on the whole sediment transport might be to the north in this area.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I had one other question. Yeah, you had brought up the point of putting sediment on adjacent lots, which is adjacent to the project, nourishing adjacent to the project for sediments off the project. And Applied Coastal have brought that up, I mean, many times over the years of these presentations. And I was curious, you had brought up the concept of doing that, but were you just talking about putting it on the returns, or were you talking about farther down the beach?
If it's the comment that I believe you're referring to is Applied Coastal, I think, talked about placing sand on the beach adjacent to the project above the mean high water. And our response was that the ramps that are on either end of the project constitute excess volume of sand that's available to be used on the template, or that can be washed off the template as it gets, as the toe gets scoured away, nibbled away, and it washes in. we think having it on the ramps at either end is a better solution than placing it on the beach above mean high water, so that we're not placing the material on the beach and usurping that beach area from public use. So keeping it on the ramps makes it available to the system in the same manner in which Applied Coastal is mentioning, but then it avoids placing it on the beach and interfering with the use of the beach.
Right. No, I totally agree with putting it on the ends of the project. I mean, it definitely was a plus to have done that. You know, last year with the big project was great. You got some in there, but given the high energy in that spot, it doesn't last long.
Right.
And I do see could see the plus side of having it farther down the beach, higher up, so that during those storm events where we run out of product on the tubes, that we do have stuff still contributing in those higher. I mean,
Correct.
I can't imagine that it couldn't be spread out to public access, wouldn't be affected.
Well, I think as I think about what Gordon has presented, what Les has talked about, that the idea of having it higher on elevation, that then the lower parts can be eroded out and the whole area kind of slumped down, as opposed to having it at a lower elevation above mean high water, but within an area subject to wave run-up, allows that area to be stored at a higher elevation and contributing to the storms further, in terms of time, further into the length of the storm than if it was just on the beach above mean high water, where it has, through cross-transport sediment mechanisms, has a chance of being washed out earlier in the storm than if it's stored at the higher elevation. I think there's a benefit to that.
Okay, I've noticed that we have events where we just have a lot of sediment sitting at the top of the tube. Eventually, there's a pile up top that's just not coming down anymore. So I just, like I say, I'd sort of see the benefits of something farther down the beach, farther up for that adjustment. But I do understand there's a small period of the storm event, 24 hours, that it's getting that far up.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thought. I used to sort of not think it was I couldn't see the point of it until I started more thinking about the inadequacies of the tube, the design, that it was like where it had its flaws, and I sort of thought that was sort of not a bad idea after having having you guys in front of us all these years. But
Yeah, I mean, Jamie could probably speak more to the actual observed conditions this past winter of that material getting washed away pretty, so it is available to the system. And I think being higher in elevation is probably keeps it available to the system a little longer into the storm than if it's at a lower elevation.
So I have a final question,
Please.
I think, which is, so it's about the placement loss of the actual length of the geotube in relationship to the rest of the beach. Do you have any calculation on that?
Could you repeat the question?
The placement loss, so the actual percentage of beach that'll be under the geotubes? Well,
you mean
through the length of the geotubes, then how much of the beach will actually be
Okay.
under the geotubes as a percentage
Yeah.
over that length?
I'd have to open up the notice of intent. I think we calculated that for the notice.
So did you? Then I must have missed it.
In terms
So,
of
okay.
in terms of the notice of intent, talking about the length of bank and the area of beach. So we'll double check and we can get back to you on that.
I'll double check myself. That's okay.
So just you're talking about the new section?
Well,
the
yes,
new
the
section,
total.
the proposed geotube
Yeah,
sections?
you know.
Yes, for sure we've calculated various acreages, and we can get whatever acreage data you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, we have all of that calculated. It's part of the permitting process.
Okay.
I know for sure for the Army Corps of Engineers as well, because we also have acreages calculated for during construction. So we have to provide all of that to them. So that's available if you let us know exactly which numbers you want. Yeah, on that graphic there, we have all of the various acreages, like the water trench area, the anchor tubes, the footprint of the geotextile, what's covered, what the volumes are. That is all being calculated. So that's available.
So did I miss it in the NOI? Is that what you're saying? Because I don't see any acreage calculations on that particular.
No, it's not on this figure, but we, like I said, I'll double check the notice of intent, but as Gordon mentioned, we have, it should be in the NOI on the form,
right.
but we'll double check. If it's not on there, we'll provide it.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, just put the notice in there.
Yeah.
67,000.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I have here.
Sorry.
So if there's no more final questions,
Well-
I would request a continuance.
Wait, so we have public.
Oh, sure.
So if there are no more questions, I'll open it up to the public. Any questions from the public? No questions from the public? Okay, and no other questions from the board?
I just have one.
Please.
It's not a technical question. I just wanted to review, we had down for topics for the next hearing, which is scheduled for November the 19th. We had listed before when we made this list, looking at wildlife habitat and wildlife impact. So I think your question on the invertebrates would be included in that. But I know we had also briefly touched upon, and there was some concern about bank swallow habitat and going over that from the distance and some other wildlife that's come up. And then the other area that I know we wanted to run through was also going through the coastal engineering structure kind of basic qualification process. So reviewing pre-78 status both under the state and local bylaw and regulations and going through that to make sure that the lots involved, that everyone understood which ones qualify, which ones may qualify as potential gap lots, and what's included to run through that whole process, just to make sure everyone was comfortable with that, because we don't often deal with a 4,000 foot of CES. So those are the two I had down. If anyone wants anything else, we can add that in. And then I think we had talked about the next hearing after that is scheduled for December the 3rd, doing some summary or outstanding issues that people have had that have come up, and then kind of deciding what next steps at that meeting you guys wanted to take. That sound about right?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think that's right. In terms of the complexity and volume of that information, I think it gives us some time to also review some proposed findings and conditions, not on the assumption that the permit will be granted, although obviously we hope it will be, but because doing so will help focus on where there might be additional area of need for information or discussion or development. And so we'd see that as being part of that meeting as well. So I'd like to request a continuance to the 19th.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you.
Continue till 19th.
All right.
Okay. So we have other business.
A little bit, not much. Just normal stuff.
Okay.
I'd say they have a couple more things on the agenda, so if people want to go and talk, please take that outside while the commission finishes up.
What else we got on this thing? I don't even have the agenda in front of me. Just normal stuff. And reports, commissioner comments.
I did have an administrative comment.
You have an administrative comment?
So on Wednesday too, we'll be bringing the proposed schedule for 2019 to everyone. So one of the things that we've tried to do with that schedule, just for everyone to kind of get warmed up to it a little bit, obviously the room upstairs won't be available for use in 2019 or as available for use. So we set a rough schedule on moving down here on a permanent basis, just because there's not a lot of other meeting space that accommodates a group of our size regularly. I mean, even with just commission staff and kind of the regular Joes that come in. I mean, we're running about 20 per meeting. They had originally looked at the meeting room at the water company that when I went through it, it seats like 12. So it just doesn't work. Being down here, but I think the way we're talking about doing it, and there's some benefits to it, is moving our meeting date from what has been Wednesdays to Thursdays on a permanent basis. There's two advantages. That is, it gives us a lot of flexibility for field viewing times being Monday or Tuesday for schedules to avoid holidays. The other benefit of moving to Thursdays is that also allows all of our applicants to have to advertise in the paper. They do it 2 weeks now because they have to be at least 1 week prior. So if they advertise the Thursday before, it's 1 day short of the requirement. That if we move to Thursdays, we could run it in the paper before and provide. I mean, now running an ad through the INM, it costs almost $300 to do the 2 weeks for the ads. That it's a little bit of cost savings for people. And it allows a little bit more flexibility. And I think what we'll probably end up do to accommodate that too is shift our filing deadlines from Fridays to Thursdays, so it gives an extra day in case there's snafu or something that's there. But I know we've been meeting on Wednesdays since I've been in front of the commission since 2000, and it's always been on Wednesdays. So it's a bit of a shift. I know that everyone kind of schedules for Wednesdays. The only other day that was really available for this room was Fridays, and I just said, no way. So if people want to look, if that looks like it's going to be a total nightmare for people, it actually reduces our meetings by 1, I think, during the year too. Yeah, that's what I said. And it makes it a little screwy because we also are coordinating around the Board of Health, who is in here on some Thursdays, but I think it's a better schedule that gives us I would say a more permanent meeting space and more permanent home. So we'll bring those exact dates for people to see, and I'll probably email them out in advance because we have it kind of squared away. We already booked it too, but we can always get rid of that booking if we need to, but we didn't want to lose out on the space when it was open. So that was my big administrative comment for the day.
Yeah, the only comment I have was the Tuesdays would be HTC.
Yeah.
There could be some overlap, but
So
that's for the viewings.
For viewings. Also, as a reminder.
Well, for Terry too, and so because you have.
Yeah.
Right.
So, well, that's what's nice about Thursdays is most of all the other meetings are off, so
Yeah.
we
I
can
just come by
still
the office,
get her
like,
excellent
Wednesday.
services. And as a reminder too, when we actually get back to regular field viewings, we're back to 3 p.m. because time changed. If we went at 4, by the time we got to the second site, it would be as black as Joe's vest. So it's a little tougher. So I think that's it. Thanks everyone for their patience in coming, talking about sand. A lot of talking about sand.
Talking.
Move to adjourn.
Yeah. Do we have a second?